basically, I would just like to, in summarizing, a couple of the take-home points from each presentation, basically is that the ancient wheats represent different species and subspecies which have great genetic diversity, 4 important traits as has been pointed out. And while there are overall differences amongst the species in nutrition and baking quality, the qualities of any one variety among these species cannot be determined without testing. The seed evaluation and increase of adapted lines along with cultivar development is needed for future crop expansion. Management practices needed to be refined, and affordable small-scale hulling capacity remains an issue in producing ancient grains, and new options are still in the R&D stages. But for more information on this project and the ancient grains and the value-added project, please check out these websites and watch as time goes on. The Ogren site, the Green Market site, and you'll find some of the agronomic data at the NDSU Carrington Research Extension site.
So before we have a question, we have a comment from someone who said that in his experience, some of the ancient grains can be susceptible to different diseases. He's seen some powdery mildew, Staganospora nododorum, I hope I pronounced that properly, blot, septoria, and stinking smut that limited their yield. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Steve, or anyone else. You might need to unmute your microphone.
Yes, I could comment on that. Yeah, I should have been a little bit more clear on that. It tends to be the leaf diseases and some of the diseases such as you mentioned, the smut and the powdery mildew. So from some of the weather diseases that come from wetter conditions do seem to hit the emmer and Einkorn as much, but it seems like some of the leaf rust and the stem rust is where a lot of the disease is better. A little bit too, I have noticed that as the most part, it does get a scab or a fusarium head blight, but it doesn't seem to be, it's not worse than wheat when you grow it side by side with some of the modern spring wheats. So yes, there are some diseases, but some it isn't as bad.
Okay, thank you. Here's a comment from a baker. In her experience, baking with Einkorn, she said that it handles very differently from conventional flours. It hydrates differently, it results in a stickier dough, and there's not as much tension. And she's been unsuccessful in finding resources that address this. Can anyone point her to resources that would discuss working with these grains from a practical standpoint? Let's see. Some of you may be muted, so I want to unmute yourself. Or everyone can unmute themselves.
Yep, there we go. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, this is June. I think that Ellie Ragosa, you can reach her at growseed.org, is pretty knowledgeable in working with Einkorn, with Einkorn, and we'll be learning more as the supply develops, and that's all I have really. I think that, yeah, she's probably a direct connection other than searching online for blogs and see what people are saying.
Okay, here's a question about whether you know of any university program that's working with Spelt.
As far as breeding, I'm assuming you're asking?
I'm not sure exactly what he means. If you, the questioner wants to be a little more specific, they can type in more information.
Okay, well, most universities are working with Spelt, and I'm assuming they're probably talking about winter spelt, which is a little bit more common. I'm not really sure a lot at this point in time. I would assume kind of in the Ohio area and stuff like that, there's been kind of a history of a lot of it growing in that area, and I'm not sure if university people are doing some work there or not, but I don't know of any universities that have programs dedicated to it.
Okay. Let's see. Here's the next question. Let's see. What kind of test weights do you get with Emmer, Einkorn, and Spelt?
Okay, there is no official test weights, and so therefore there was not a lot of official procedures to do that. But so basically the test weights that out of North Dakota have been getting, average on Emmers 35 pounds, Einkorn would be very similar, maybe slightly less, 32, and Spelt is going to be very similar to Emmer. When we get our higher, what test weight in North Dakota is very correlated to yield. When we get good yielding conditions, it seems to be as we get heavier test weights. And so like this year, with higher yields were some of our better test weights. But on the average, 35 pounds in the hull is about as good as we get.
Okay.
Or I should say average.
Yeah. We're getting a couple questions about how easy it is for organic heritage varieties to become cross-pollinated with genetically modified organisms, and how would a farmer screen for this?
This is Julie. All of these grains are self-pollinated, so the crossing rate between any varieties of the same species is generally less than 3% and is over very short distances. There are no genetically modified varieties of wheat on the market right now, so it wouldn't be possible for one of the landrace or historic varieties to hybridize with a GMO wheat. It would be possible for them to hybridize with a modern variety that was growing very close to them, but the pollen doesn't travel as far as something like maize would, and it's naturally self-pollinating, so each plant pollinates the flowers, their own flower. The other species, Einkorn and Emmer, are the same, and it's possible to get hybrids between the species, but it's so rare that I don't think anybody needs to worry about that.
Okay, yeah, we did have a question coming in about that, whether Einkorn can cross-pollinate with Emmer. So
it's possible, but usually you have to do it in a greenhouse under very controlled conditions if you wanted to do that.
Okay. We have a question about the shelf life of Einkorn, hulled and dehulled. Anyone speak to that?
That would be shelf life in terms. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I think.
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. I think if the whole grains are pretty good for at least a year. Once you crack that grain, you're exposing all the parts of that, and they do contain their whole grain, so they're going to contain a little bit of essential oil, fats and oils, and that will go rancid. It depends on the conditions that you keep them in. I try to keep my grains in the coolest spot in my house. Some people keep them in the freezer. I think on average, you might have a couple months probably before they'll start to turn a little bit. And as you work with them, you'll get used to what that smells like when a fresh flower starts to turn. So that's my answer.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question from a grower in Montana, and he said that they've grown Emmer and tried unsuccessfully to grow Spelt. They had 97 acres of Emmer that yielded 34 BPA last year, and their average yield for RSW is 25 BPA. He said that Emmer is a great crop in their ecosystem, but how do we get our crop to market? Do you have any suggestions?
I would want to know what your outlets are to start with. There's a few. With direct marketing, we've had a couple of small growers start to work grains into their rotations, and they're taking that grain, maybe it's even 3 to 10 acres, to somebody who has a grain cleaner. A lot of within this grant, we're working on equipment and equipment sharing, and also looking at cooperatives later on to see if they might be appropriate for some of our grain growers. But in the meantime, if you're doing any direct marketing, get it cleaned, put it in a bag, label it well, and tell your customers about it. If you're trying to sell into a bigger marketplace, then you'll have to find a buyer who can get it to market for you.
Okay, here's a question. I think it would be for Steve.
This is Steve.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to address that aspect just a little bit in North Dakota here, as some of the farmers have grown Emmer for a couple years now. we're starting to develop markets based on that scale that that Montana farmer has. You know, so in other words, some of the production that the North Dakota farmers have had is working towards buyers that are starting to willing to come forward to buy, you know, larger scale production. It hasn't quite happened yet, but it's being worked on. But that is coming soon, hopefully.
Okay, here's another question for you, Steve. Were the variety trials completed under organic conditions?
Yes, all variety trials. All variety trials, you know, within this last year, and what you saw in pictures were under organic conditions. And when you look at some of the data on the website, you will notice that they'll tell you whether they're organic or conventional.
Okay. Here's a question about why, if the grains and dehulling have such a long-term history in Europe and elsewhere, why isn't more of the seed and technology brought to the Americas? Anyone like to comment on that?
I can take a stab at that. I think in Europe there's a long history of these grains being grown and used in food. They spread from the Fertile Crescent through the Mediterranean, and so in more stressful environments, Einkorn and Emmer are still grown and used in traditional foods. I think the technology in Europe, it's also a problem for small-scale farmers. There's more Einkorn and Emmer grown in Italy, so there's more equipment available there. I think the market hasn't necessarily been in the U.S., and as that develops, we'll see more of the technology come over, especially for small-scale operations. But right now it's difficult to get things imported, especially the small-scale machinery. And exchanging varieties across country lines is extremely difficult because of phytosanitary regulations. So to import any seed, you need a permit, you need several inspections, and that whole process takes a long time and is difficult to do unless there's a strong demand for it.
Okay, here's another harvesting question. Emmer tends to clog up my small Chinese combine due to what appears to be very aggressive barbs. Is Einkorn similar to Emmer in that respect?
Yes, that would be. That is one thing that has been noticed over the years. It's the barbs, or they call it the awns, or the beards, as some call it too. It's very aggressive and very, as you saw some of the initial pictures that Frank had, were some very good shots of showing that. Einkorn can do the same thing. We did have a small increase this year. One of the farmers did something field scale, and he complained heavily about that, and I've noticed that also in my research combines. That isn't that way every year, but what tends to be, you know, the crop may not be quite dry enough, or, you know, it seems to come from wetter conditions. But yes, it can definitely be a problem. The awns, or the beards, of both of those crops are a problem in harvest and in also cleaning up for seed production. So many times we need to run them through a de-honor, just like barley.
Okay, here's a question about whether or not you've seen any fusarium problem.
Yes, I do see it. You'll notice the obviously you don't see the wheat kernels unless it's dehulled, so what you'll notice is the pink glooms. It doesn't seem to be, as I mentioned earlier, when you're growing some modern spring wheats side by side, which we've had some pretty bad fusarium these last few years in North Dakota here, you know, the Emmer does have it, and it does lower the crop yields, but it doesn't seem to be any worse than spring wheat. Although we've never ran DON amounts yet on that, so we don't have a good indication of how much vomitoxin is in there, but it does get head blight, scab.
Okay, here's kind of an opposite marketing question from the last one. As a professional baker, can you suggest how I can get some Einkorn and Emmer flour?
This is June. Yeah, I think right now the only two sources I know of are growseed.org and Jovial.
Okay, thank you. Here's a grower who's growing emmer in the UK, and he says, I'm told that it is that as it is a winter variety, it definitely needs vernalization. Have you tried growing winter varieties of emmer in the spring and with any success?
I did. Winter emmers have been identified and such. Haven't worked with them yet, although this last year I did have one that was identified as a winter, and just to clarify it, I planted a few seeds, and it did not shoot ahead, so it definitely needed vernalization.
Okay. Here's a comment from Arizona. Okay, sorry.
If it's an older variety, it may be what they call facultative, which means you can plant it in the winter or in the spring. You could try planting some in the spring, like Steve said, and see. You may get a few plants that will head and a lot that do need vernalization. If it's a more modern variety, it's likely all of the same type, so it would be either all winter or all spring, and if it's a winter variety, it likely needs the vernalization.
Okay, we have a group listening from Tucson, Arizona, Native Seed Search, and they were wondering if you're trialing any of their heritage wheats, Pima Club, Sonoran White Wheat, or Bart. If you could comment on those.
None of those wheats, I believe, are. I have not seen any of those listed on our lists.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. As these ancient grains develop their market, how will the labeling laws for wheat require the identity as wheat, or will this impact the growth of these markets?
I don't think there are any labeling requirements right now.
Okay.
June, you probably know more.
Yeah, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what's meant, but it says, how will the labeling laws for wheat require the identity as wheat, and will this impact the growth of these markets? So maybe it's
that's a little bit confusing. I don't know if, well, from doing the search on ancient grains, first of all, there's all sorts of things that are lumped in there. So I agree with Julie that there are no labeling requirements. I do think it's important, though, that people understand that these are wheats, and because there's such a push to market gluten-free products and get in on that market, and it can be confusing for the consumer, like lots of labeling issues are confusing for the consumer.
Okay, here's another question from a baker. Is it preferable for ancient grains to be oxidized after milling or before baking, and should they be stored the same way as more modern wheats?
I think that you have to work with that and do some experimentation. I don't totally understand the oxidizing of the flour. I just spoke with a baker yesterday who was working with fresh ground flours, and I asked him about that, and he said that they prefer to have the younger flour. So I think it really depends on the baker and how you're working with your grain. He was definitely an artisanal baker in the true sense of the word. He calibrates his mixes daily, checking his starter. So that's beyond my expertise to answer that fully.
Okay. I know you said that there are not very many seed sources, but there's someone who's wondering where she could buy seeds for Einkorn or Emmer.
Einkorn, I do not believe that I would know of any source. On Emmers, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's a variety that was released out of Montana called Lucille. The Montana State Seed Foundation does not grow foundation seed of this variety anymore, so that was one place to get it, so now it would have to be purchased from farmers. Some of the, as far as Emmers goes, there are some farmers in North Dakota I know that do have Lucille and North Dakota Common Emmer.
Okay, thanks. We're running pretty low on time, but I'm just going to ask another a set of questions here. We're getting some questions on how far south einkorn can be grown successfully, and whether you're looking for warm states to do tests in, for example, Ohio.
How far south? And that was Ohio.
Well, I think that was a different question, actually. I think it was a general question on how far south it can be grown, and then also whether you're looking for warmer states to do testing in.
Well, I think over time it would be great to have information on many of the different areas on how they perform, particularly as people are looking to want to grow some of these grains. To answer the question as far how south, I think I would have to answer it in the sense of not knowing all the environments on how well other spring grains perform. In other words, if spring oats or spring wheat performs well in your environment, these emmer and einkorns would do very similar. So I would have to always, getting out of environments I'm not familiar with, compare it to how you're growing some of the other grains in that area.
Okay, yeah, Virginia is where the person was also asking about.
Einkorn is grown more in Mediterranean climate.
Uh-oh, your sound.
Historically, that's my sound is bad again.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Not very well. I think you might need to unplug and then plug back in your headset because we're losing the quality of the sound there. In the meantime, I just want to mention that we had a comment about where you can find Massachusetts and New York state-grown organic einkorn flour and grain with wholesale discounts, and that resource is growseed.org. So I don't know if we can... Oh, there you are. Okay, great.
I was just going to say that it's traditionally been grown in very hot climates, but also very dry climates. So it may survive the heat, but it may not have resistance to the diseases that come with a more humid climate.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time, but I would like to thank everyone for all your questions and mention once again that you can find our many other recorded presentations on organic farming topics at the link on your screen. And so thank you very much again, Frank, Julie, June, and Steve for giving this very informative presentation. And thanks to everyone for joining us.